Welcome, everyone. Everyone who was here, bearing with us chatting, thanks, and hope it was interesting. We're really excited to be hosting this event. My name is Leigha Gillespie. I'm the co-chair of the Palestine Subcommittee for the National Lawyers Guild. If you are not familiar with the Guild, we are the oldest progressive bar association in the United States. We do a lot of legal education. We mobilize for legal support for those who are being targeted by anti-repression or by repression tactics. We do continued legal education, and we do a lot of support on the Palestine Subcommittee for the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And we're very excited to host this event in partnership with Taxpayers Against Genocide. I'm going to hand it over to Seth to introduce himself. He's going to co-moderate with me tonight.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Seth Donnelly. I'm one of the co-founders of Taxpayers Against Genocide, along with Anna Marie Stenberg, who I believe is here, and Tariq Kanana. Um, and I'm also been a long-term public high school educator and human rights activist. So I'm also honored to be here.
Great. So to get started, I'm going to introduce us to our panelists for today, and then we're going to get started with a question directed to Seth. We have a few questions that we've put together for our panelists, and then we will also be accepting more questions. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. We'll be moderating that, and then at the end, once we've gone through our prepared questions, then we'll go ahead and take some questions from the audience. So thank you again for being with us, and we're very excited to get started. Um, our first panelist is Maria Kari. She's a lawyer based in Houston, Texas. She co-created the Gaza Family Project, which aims to reunite Palestinians with their loved ones in Gaza through various legal means. She's assisted in the evacuation of 70 United States citizens from Gaza to the United States, and she's one of the drafters and filing attorneys for the IACHR complaint that we'll be discussing this evening. Huwaida Arraf is a Palestinian American international law attorney from Detroit, Michigan. She's a co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, which is committed to nonviolent resistance to Palestinian subjugation. She's an active participant with the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, and she's been detained twice this year after being abducted in international waters by the settler colony of Israel. Huwaida and I worked together at the National Lawyers Guild, and she actually was the previous co-chair of the Palestine Subcommittee. Huwaida is also one of the drafters and filing attorneys for the IACHR complaint that we'll be discussing this evening. Tariq Ra'ouf is a US-born Palestinian writer from San Francisco with family members in occupied Palestine, including in Gaza and a village near Jerusalem. Tariq has lost dozens of family members who have been killed in Gaza over the past 2 years. Tariq engages in sustained public advocacy, including producing social content, protesting across the country, as well as participating in the Global March to Gaza earlier this year in Cairo. And he managed the communications for the Global Samud Flotilla ground team in their historic action to break the blockade and deliver life-saving humanitarian assistance to Gaza in September this year. He is a complainant in this complaint, and he'll be talking about his role and his family. So with that, I want to hand it over to Seth, just to kind of orient us to this conversation. Could you give us a short history of the Taxpayers Against Genocide organization or group? How did the decision get made to bring the complaint along with TAG to the commission? And can you talk about the way that TAG availed of all of the domestically available remedies in order to file the current complaint?
Absolutely. So, TAG, we started a little over a year ago, actually. It was in September of 2024. And we started in Northern California, the Bay Area in Northern California, where many of us have been involved in efforts to get ceasefire resolutions, we were in street protests, and we were increasingly frustrated at even when we did get ceasefire resolutions for city councils, it obviously wasn't enough. We believed in taking to the streets, and we still do, but we were seeing that while we were doing all these measures, the genocide was intensifying and escalating. Um, Many of us repeatedly, like some of our tag members, literally contacted their congresspeople every day, saying cut off military aid. I remember in January 2024, right after the International Court of Justice's ruling that there was a plausible case of genocide and that the case needed to proceed. After that ruling happened, some of my students where I was teaching at the time met with our congressperson, Mike Thompson, and urged him. They said, clearly there's a genocide happening. Some of these students are Palestinian, some of them are Jewish, and some of them are other identities, but we're just concerned. And they told him to his face, there's a genocide happening. We need you to not reauthorize more of our family's tax dollars in the form of military aid to Israel. Um, he did not. And in fact, like the majority of members of Congress in April 2024, he voted to reauthorize the Israeli Supplemental Security Act, and it sent like I think that the total was 26 billion, and of that 15 billion was earmarked as military aid and weapon sales to Israel. And by that time, the genocide had continued to escalate in those 4 months since our meeting with him. So long story short, my experience, my students' experience was mirrored in this experience of a lot of the constituents in Northern California. And we found each other in the course of organizing protests, and we said, what more can we do? So a few of us, again, as I mentioned, Anna Marie Stenberg and Tariq Kanana. Anna Marie is a veteran activist from Mendocino, California, who's done work for decades. And Tariq's one of the founders of Sonoma County for Palestine, incredible Palestinian American activist and a leader in the area where I live. We said, well, let's organize a class action lawsuit against our Congress people for illegally using our tax dollars to fund the genocide in Palestine. And so we started with Mike Thompson as well as Jared Huffman, who represented these counties to the north, these districts to the north. But then the word spread, and it spread to include every county that makes up the federal court district of Northern California, and we included all the elected officials in that area, from Nancy Pelosi to Representative Anna Eshoo in the South Bay, Pelosi, of course, out of San Francisco Bay Area. We included every congressperson that voted to use our tax dollars to fund the genocide, and we filed it in federal court. We knew, and that was a year ago in December 19th that we did this. We knew that it was an uphill battle. We knew that we're not going to win. Although it wasn't performative, we felt our case was really powerful. We felt that it is, in fact, illegal for them to use our tax dollars to fund genocide on many different levels. We also think that even though they have immunity under the free speech and debate clause, that immunity is not absolute and that it was a fight worth fighting. And most importantly, we felt that in the course of going on the offensive and going to the folks that control the power of the purse and who are funding the genocide, we would organize a more militant, powerful movement, directing our energies increasingly against the U.S. government within the belly of the beast, so to speak. And so we did, and it ended up having a class of 1,500 people, and then the word spread across the country. And we ended up having several thousand people across the country wanting to join. Now we have like 4,000 active members. Um, we were shut down on the same basis that the federal court system shut down previous class actions. The Center for Constitutional Rights had worked with Palestinian American plaintiffs, including Tariq's father, who sued the Biden administration before us. And they used the same precedent to shut us down, that we were asking the court to make foreign policy and that the court doesn't do that. They use that same rationale to shut down a case by the late Rachel Corrie's parents and family members of Palestinians who were killed by Caterpillar bulldozers, by IDF soldiers driving the bulldozers, and said that they couldn't sue the company because those bulldozers were bought by Congress, and Congress and the court doesn't make foreign policy. So it's called the political question doctrine, and so they use that to shut us down. We disagreed, of course. We were asking to uphold basic human law. But at that time, we were very fortunate to be in communication with National Lawyers Guild attorneys, including Huwaida, and we had this momentum, all these people across the country. And we didn't want to back down. And at that point, we started brainstorming, and that led us with Huwaida and these National Lawyers Guild attorneys, and that led us to escalate our fight to the international arena. And so with that, I'm going to pass it. I'm going to pass it to you, Huwaida, in terms of, because I think it's obviously the natural segue. And um, as I pass it to you, I just want to say how honored and thrilled grassroots activists and TAG have been to work with Huwaida, who's also a grassroots activist, but is an amazing attorney. And then Huwaida was able to help put us in touch with Maria, who's been wonderful. And so it's been a real synergy of the legal and the political strategy. Um, so, Huwaida, my question for you is, can you explain um, what the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights is and what role it plays and what kind of outcomes we're hoping to get from this petition? Um, and, look, this idea to go to the Inter-American Commission really came from you. We were trying to think of all these different outlets. We did file a report with the UN, but really the commission is our driving complaint. So with that, tell us more about the strategy behind it.
Yeah, thanks, Seth, and thank you, Leah, and the National Lawyers Guild, the International Committee, for hosting this. When we were talking ahead of time, we were hoping that this would be a little bit more interactive because we could use your help, and I'll explain a little bit why. But yeah, as Seth mentioned, it's almost impossible to file any kind of case or to hold the United States government accountable for its international crimes. It's basically insulated itself with the political question doctrine and others. And specifically, when you talk about members of Congress, they do have immunity. So that was always going to be an uphill battle. But as Seth said, there was so much momentum because people were outraged and people are, I don't know if some of you have seen, but there was a report over a year and a half ago documenting how so many in a span of a short period of time, like Congress was inundated, especially Democratic members of Congress, with phone calls and letters and emails on this and requests for meeting more than any other issue. And anonymously, some people who worked on the Hill were saying, never had we seen such a disconnect between what our constituents were telling us and how our members of Congress were voting. So members of Congress were ignoring what their constituents were telling them. So a lot of outrage. And because the case we knew, when the National Lawyers Guild was contacted and we came on, we unfortunately, because of the precedent, we knew that the case wouldn't get very far in domestic courts. And so we started brainstorming what could we do to not lose this energy? Where could we go? There was a shadow report filed with the UN periodic review. As some of you might know, the US has pulled out, and this possibly is the first time a country has pulled out of this mechanism, basically saying that it is not going to listen or participate in this mechanism that is intended for other countries to basically hold each other accountable for their human rights record. We thought about the International Criminal Court, but for a number of reasons, we decided not to go there. One of them being that the Trump administration sanctioned the International Criminal Court, and it is under a lot of pressure. The Trump sanctions have really hampered its ability to function, and it is constantly getting complaints and evidence tons filed with regard to Israeli war criminals. And organization here, Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, had filed a complaint against the Biden administration. So there was a lot already going to the ICC, and we had the historic arrest warrants that were issued against the two Israeli war criminals, Netanyahu and Gallant, and wanted really the limited resources of the ICC to kind of be focused on pushing those forward. So another international forum that had not been used, did a lot of research and saw that we actually haven't used it, I think, in the as Palestinians or those who are active in the Palestinian liberation, Palestinian rights struggle, is the Inter-American human rights system. So we've decided to file a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And this is a regional human rights body. There's the European Court of Human Rights, there's the African Court of Human Rights, etc. Well, there's the Inter-American system, in which there is a commission and there is a court. It was created shortly after World War II, where, you know, these countries across the America ostensibly came together and said, you know, technically never again to say violence, dictatorship, and impunity. And we're going to establish these regional systems to hold governments accountable. And so the commission's role is to monitor, investigate, and respond to human rights violations committed by any of the OAS, the Organization of American States, the member states. And I recognize, so the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is a body that is of the OAS. And I definitely want to recognize that there are deep, legitimate criticisms of the OAS. It has a long history of US dominance, of political selectivity, and even complicity in coups and interventions that violated the very human rights it claims to defend. So we're under no illusions about that, but we do see part of our work is to hold these institutions to their own standards, to force them to confront these contradictions. And by bringing a petition to the Inter-American Commission, we're kind of saying, if you claim to stand for human rights, then stand for them in Palestine, to hold the United States accountable here. And if the commission refuses to act, you know, that failure will expose the moral bankruptcy of that system, which is recognized by Latin American countries and the Caribbean. But it does exist. There is, I said, a commission and there's a court. The United States participates in the commission. It does not recognize the legitimacy of the court. So the United States never signed on to the founding document, the jurisdictional document of the court, but it is held or bound by what's called the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, which is the kind of jurisdictional foundational document of the commission. So we decided to file this petition on behalf of US taxpayers, and we wanted to highlight, also identify certain Palestinian Americans. We know so many Palestinian Americans that have been directly impacted, had family members, continue to have family members killed, injured, starved in Gaza. So we have, and Tariq being one of them, we have some named Palestinian American petitioners, and then we have US taxpayers against genocide as a whole. And this petition is against the US government. So it isn't specifically against Congress, it's not against one person, but it is against the whole US government. And we're arguing that by funding, arming, and politically shielding Israel as it carries out a genocide in Gaza, the US is violating the very rights to life, liberty, personal security, and equality before the law that are guaranteed and that the United States are obligated to uphold under the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. The commission is not a court, so it can't force the government to stop what it's doing, but its findings do carry significant moral, legal, and diplomatic weight. If the commission should determine that the United States is responsible for the grave human rights violations that we're alleging, it can issue recommendations. It could call for reparations, policy changes. Generally, with other cases, it can also refer cases to the court, but because, as I said, in this case, the United States doesn't recognize the legitimacy or the jurisdiction of the court, it won't be able to do that in this case. But again, a recommendation and a call for a policy change, such as what we're demanding, that the US stop funding Israel, it stops transferring weapons to Israel, stops politically shielding Israel from accountability. These are things that even if the United States doesn't adhere to them, you know, we are making a record. We are making a record for history. We are making a record for and future attempts to hold not only Israel accountable, but in this case, we are saying the United States, Israel's committing this genocide, but the United States is enabling it and is a partner in it. Just one last thing, and I'll let Maria talk about more of the substance. In urgent cases like Gaza, there is a mechanism under the under the rules of the commission where we can ask for what's called precautionary measures, and these are like emergency directives to prevent irreparable harm. So we're saying basically, because this case can take years, and we're saying that we can't wait until the commission actually issues a finding on our allegations, because every day that passes, our our petitioners are being irreparably harmed. So we've requested these measures. And one of the first things that we ask for is the commission to urge the United States right now to halt all arms transfer and other support to Israel immediately. I think we'll talk a little bit about it later, but as expected, even in this, and as I talked about earlier, even in this body, there are politics at play. And while when there is a request for precautionary measures, I mean, the point is every day that passes, people are being harmed irreparably. And so while the case itself can take years to be resolved, we're asking for these measures immediately. And that generally moves the complaints quicker. Generally within a few weeks, you can have some movement on a case. We filed this on May 14th of this year. So it's been over 6 months now that we've filed this, and we've heard nothing. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, what we can do there and our strategy. But that's what we decided to do. It is in the first time that I think that we as Palestinian activists and Palestinians in general are using this human rights body internationally to try to get justice, to try to affect the policy of the United States in supporting Israel and its genocide. And as activists, as lawyers, as people of conscience, I think it's incumbent on us to really use every tool at our disposal. And like I said, despite the very legitimate criticism of this particular forum, we're using it. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. I was just stunned. Thank you, Huwaida. That was an amazing presentation. Um, and I'm glad this is being recorded, especially for folks that couldn't make it but want to be here. And we do have a nice turnout, so this is great. So the next question, then, Maria, is for you. So one of the legal bases for the complaint is, as Huwaida mentioned, the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. Can you explain this declaration more and its relevance to our complaint? And what are some of the other legal what's some of the other legal bases for the complaint beyond that, the American Declaration?
Yeah, so thank you again for having me. So my name is Maria. I'm talking to you guys all from Houston, and just want to give you like a quick background on what led me to joining this team that Huwaida was leading. You know, at the start of the genocide, I inadvertently found myself involved with getting Americans from Gaza home. And we brought home, through federal lawsuits, several dozen people, I think something like 86. And each person who was coming back home had the most horrifying story. They had left behind a lot of loved ones who had no means of evacuation because either they were not American or some other sort of issue prevented them from being able to exit. And around the time that I had shared a panel with Huwaida at another conference and found out that she was working on this historic, unprecedented petition, I was sort of facing that political question doctrine in the federal courts myself, where we had the final batch of Americans stuck in Gaza, no way of getting them out. We had knocked on every single door in our country, right? From the halls of Congress to the federal courts to local elected representatives. These people had exhausted every avenue available to them, and they had been told no for various reasons or just simply ignored. It was life and death. There was a lack of compassion. I think it was the first time that I saw and fully understood what it meant to be a second-class citizen, something that I'd argued over and over in the course of my career on behalf of different populations, but to really understand that being Palestinian American in this country and watching your people being genocided, what that really means. So I had a few folks who were interested in turning outside of the US to like an international forum, and they wanted to take the US to court over it. Now, to get to an organ like the ICJ, you have to have a process that you follow whereby the state is involved and the state refers the matter. An individual can't just show up at the ICJ's door and ask for justice. But that's not the case at the Inter-American Commission. As Huwaida just explained, It is a place where individuals can file petitions. So we joined, I joined as co-counsel, but I also brought in some of my petitioners. And the reason I'm talking about these individuals is because their stories are an example, and we'll hear more about them, about some of these people, including Tariq, one of our petitioners. Their stories are the lived reality of what the charges are that we brought under the American Declaration, right? So I have in front of me the 99-page amended petition we filed on October 7th. We got done with this. So we filed May 14th, and we filed a request for precautionary measures. And then things drastically changed, and I would say escalated in like a very horrifying way when the US went from complicity to partnership through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in the summer. And as news started coming out about that, as whistleblowers started talking about that work, it became necessary to amend our petition. So that's what we did. And that amended petition was completed at the end of summer. And we were all ready to go. We had our action planned in New York, and it felt right to delay things by a few weeks. It felt right to file October 7th, the amended petition, for obvious reasons. And that 99-page document is like a living document that I think everybody should at least skim, because this is a story of what has happened to people who are our friends, our neighbors, our physicians, our teachers. Like, this is the harm that has befallen Americans in our country because of our government's continued partnership with the state of Israel and its war crimes and its genocide. So just talking you through some of the violations of the American Declaration that we have alleged, right? I felt that we could hit, I remember, Huwaida, you said this too, that we had violated pretty much every right that was listed in there, right? From life and liberty to personal security, failure to protect honor, personal reputation, private and family life, residence, the right to move freely. A note on that, what I learned from the evacuations is the Palestinians are a very unique group. And, in my pre-genocide life, I was mostly doing asylum and refugee work. And I learned that the Palestinians are a very unique group in that they have never had the right to live safely in their home, but also never have had the right to be safe and leave their home if things go sideways. So because under refugee law, you have the right to be safe in your home. And if things are no longer safe, then you have the right to flee to safety. Palestinians, by virtue of the occupation and the siege and the blockade, have never had those two fundamental rights. So we argued that residence and movement, the inviolability of home, protection from arbitrary detention. We talked about Barak and Hashim Malaga, two petitioners who are from Chicago, and I was working on their evacuation lawsuit, and while we were waiting to get them out, they were detained, taken hostage by IDF, and they remain at Ofer prison. Two boys from Chicago. Equality before the law, what does that mean? A violation of the right to due process and equal protection, to be equal before the law. Well, it's what we talked about when we say you go to the courts, but the US has found a way to insulate itself from accountability. And it's justice not for all, but for some. A violation of your rights to religious and expression and art. One of the things we do in our petition is we have our complainants like Tariq and others, but we also said that it was in the memory of the many we've lost, the artists, the poets, the writers, right? Like Dr. Rifat Al-Arir, Hind Rajab. So it kind of goes on that way, and it really lays out pretty much every right that you can imagine having been violated vis-a-vis this constant bankrolling, this endless, bottomless pit of funds and weaponry that the US has continued to send. And a final note on that, one of the things that we've argued in our petition is that there's, under international legal mechanisms, there's not just the obligation not to commit genocide, but there's also an obligation not to assist in the commission of genocide, right? So if a state, particularly a state that has influence or has militarized incentive where they're, sending weapons and getting paid for it or sending money and clearly have a lot of power through that relationship, they have an obligation under international law. It's repeatedly been found to not be complicit then in violations of international law. And yet that's exactly what we're seeing here in the United States. And then I think, like, you know, I can get into it more now, or we can talk about it later, what we actually mean when we say that this is like historic and unprecedented, just like understanding what it looks like when we pursue the United States before the commission, which is not something that has been done in this way. It has been done a little bit in the context of like Guantanamo, the Haitian cases where we had mass migration towards the United States, and we sent those people back to their deaths. That appeared before the commission, so we can talk a little bit about that too later.
Thank you so much, Maria. Really
Yeah, thank
informative.
you, both of you for just the background. I think not everyone is always aware of all of the different forums that are available in the international space. So I think that contextualization is really helpful to make sure that we really understand the framework of the conversation. I do want to bring in Tariq. I'm really grateful that you're here. I'm also really grateful that you've been willing to publicly share your story. It's really difficult to discuss things that are so personal. And yet, as Maria has just discussed, it's also so necessary to really drive home what is happening and why we should all care about it. So could you describe why you thought that this complaint was important and why you wanted to be involved as a complainant, as well as what you hope to achieve? I'm also hoping that you could talk about the evidence that you submitted with the complaint in your affidavit. And I also just wanted to extend my condolences because I saw that recently you have lost additional members of your family. And I just don't want us to move forward without really acknowledging the amount of loss that hasn't only occurred, but continues to occur every day.
Thank you for like all of that. Oh gosh. You know, you talk about the family members that I lost recently, and like it just like that's one of the reasons why I felt it important to join this case. I lost over the last 2 years about like 48 family members at least that we know of, that we can account for. And it's heartbreaking. It's a heartbreaking experience, to know not only that these people are being killed at the hands of a government and a military that just doesn't consider them human beings at all, but to know that those people are using weapons that my tax dollars paid for, I think is just like outrageous. It makes me so angry. And so when I heard about Taxpayers Against Genocide, and the idea that like taxpayers and American taxpayers should care where their tax money is going, like immediately I was like, yes, like of course I want to join this. But I also really wanted to join it because I think it's just personally so hurtful that like my own like tax dollars that I make from my paycheck were going to a government that was then spending it to kill people that I'm related to kill innocent civilians, you know? And so that's why I felt like it was so important. And I think this case and like the existence of Taxpayers Against Genocide in general is a really good reminder, um, not only to ordinary citizens that they can join anything at any time to try and help and make some change in this world, because like they're just like we're just average taxpayers, right? Like I'm an activist and a writer, but like behind like all of that is just a normal person that pays taxes that's angry that these tax dollars aren't going to things that are making our country better. You know, like the fact that our tax dollars aren't going to affordable health care or housing or anything, but it does go to pay for the health care and the housing for Israeli citizens. Like this like is absurd. And so what I hope, like I really hope that this like inspires people, regardless of whether or not the court system or the Inter-American Commission can like force the United States to do anything. I think that reminds me very much of the like the global march to Gaza or all of the flotilla attempts, right? Like the goal, like it's not just the fact that like those things are trying to succeed. If they don't succeed, what they do succeed in is inspiring people and showing people what it looks like to actually stand up to these governments that are really complicit and like hold them accountable. And that's like the number one thing for me is like really inspiring every single person out there to recognize that your life is being affected by the United States decisions to support Israel, whether you think it is or not, it is. And once you realize that, figure out that you have the power to join something to make some change. It doesn't have to be up to someone else. It doesn't have to be up to a politician or some like massive organization, right? Those organizations are made up of people. And like people are what makes the change in this world. And in terms of you know, examples of the evidence that I submitted, um the evidence I submitted was accounts, personal accounts of the family members that I lost. And it goes into detail some of the like most heartbreaking accounts, like Abdul Rahman, who was killed early in like November of 2023. And he was killed by an IDF soldier for trying to collect rainwater because Israel had made collecting rainwater illegal, and they disrupted all of the water systems, and collecting rainwater was the only way that he can think of to get clean water for his family, and he was shot and killed for it. And you know, I think of my cousin Sally, who was 12 years old when she got sniped in the head, a tactic that has been proven by many doctors throughout Gaza as a known tactic by the IDF to systemically target women and children by sniping them in the head and the chest because they like want to fight against every future possibility that we have. And the fact that like those things are happening with America's greatest ally and weapons that we are paying for, that with money that could be going to making our lives better. Like it's just so angering. And so like that's one of the reasons why I joined this case and why I know that like ultimately I feel like this fight is like winnable, and I think like we are going to win this fight because all of that is just atrocious. It's disgusting, and it goes to show exactly the monsters that the American military system has gone on to make. So that's why I'm here.
Thanks for sharing with us. And I think that your point is really important, that all of these efforts serve to kind of galvanize us as a movement and show that people power can achieve something. And I think in the current moment inside of the United States domestically, we're clearly seeing the nexus between what tactics have been used in Palestine and those tactics coming home to roost, and really understanding that not only in the weaponry itself, but also in the behavior. We cannot continue to expect as Americans to only watch these things happen on our screens somewhere else. We are now watching these things happen on our screens in Chicago, in Portland, in LA, and this is growing and growing and growing. And so I'm so grateful for people like you being willing to be public, because it's so painful, and there's so much at risk, but I do think that it's so powerful because we now have families in the United States that are experiencing these things, not in Palestine, but here in the United States. And this nexus is so important to really show clearly, so that more people can understand that their own safety is at risk by not standing up and holding this government accountable for what they're doing with our money. So thank you. Before we move to the Q&A, I just wanted to bring it back really quickly to Huwaida and Maria. Can you talk about the political and legal strategy for the complaint moving forward, and what actions are being taken to get support from the other participating countries in the commission, and what other people can do. I know, Huwaida, you were eager to sort of open up the QA on this and really engage our participants as well. But just kind of understanding, where do we go from here? The complaint was amended on October 7th. We're now waiting for some kind of movement in the commission itself. So what is the strategy to sort of keep this moving, galvanize support, and really engage with a broader audience in support of this complaint?
Yeah, so I'll start briefly. I mean, legally, this good, like I said, we filed this request for emergency or precautionary measures, and what we need to focus now on is getting that moving. But the complaint as a whole, it goes through phases. I mean, first, and it can take years, honestly, because first, the commission has to assess that the complaint is admissible, and there are different admissibility criteria, which we argue in the there are criteria, for example, that we've exhausted our domestic remedies, and we have, not only with this case, with the experience that TAG has in having its case dismissed, and it's true that we did not appeal, so we didn't go to the highest court in the land, but we argued that there is a history of the US dismissing these cases, and the case that a court relied on to dismiss the TAG case, the federal court in California, is Corey v. Caterpillar, where Rachel Corrie's parents tried to, and the political question doctrine. And Rachel Corrie's parents did take that case to the Ninth Circuit. And so that did go up on appeal. And basically, it was upheld that this is a political question that the courts are not going to get involved in. That was the basis that TAG's case got dismissed. And also the case that Seth mentioned, brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights, representing Tariq's father and other Palestinian and human rights organizations. They brought a case trying to also get the court to order the United States to stop sending weapons to Israel to commit the genocide or these crimes. Even though the district court judge in that case said, it is actually also very historic, that case, for anyone who didn't follow it. The judge in that case had been on the bench for 20 some years. He was a Bush appointee. And when he delivered his ruling from the bench, said that in all of his years on the bench, this was the most difficult, factually and legal case that he has heard. And while he considers that the plaintiffs have a strong case, and he basically said, because at the time the International Court of Justice had also found and issued preliminary measures, had also found that there was a plausible case of genocide. The judge in the CCR case, Judge White, said that, I don't want to misquote, but basically says that he sees, or what the evidence that was presented to him makes it seem very plausible that what the International Court of Justice said is true, and Israel's potentially committing genocide also in Gaza. And he actually urged the administration, the Biden administration at the time, to reconsider its policies, but in the end says, I don't have jurisdiction. The law doesn't give me jurisdiction because of the political question doctrine. And CCR did appeal that case. So that case also went up on appeal, and the Ninth Circuit unfortunately affirmed the ruling that dismissed the case. And so even though TAG did not appeal, we argued in our briefing that we have exhausted domestic remedies because of similar cases like this before, and we just can't get justice in domestic courts. And there are other admissibility criteria, but we argue all of them. And but the U.S. will fight us on admissibility. And then once after, hopefully we win the case on admissibility and saying that this case is admissible, then we start arguing the actual, the allegations that we make. And as Maria alluded to, like, just about every article of the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man has been violated by what the U.S. is doing in enabling and funding Israel. But also, we not only made the case under the American Declarations, but we also used international law and the U.S.'s obligations under the Genocide Convention and just under customary international law not to commit or aid in genocide. And so there are those arguments were made too, and we put a section in there saying, because someone asked in the question, like, what about the Leahy law? And we briefly talk about that the U.S. actually has laws that it's supposed to follow that would prevent it from providing Israel with these weapons, but the U.S. does not respect them or has managed to evade them when it comes, again, specifically to sending weapons to Israel. We'll talk a little bit more about the Leahy law and what's being done on that front. But so the actual legal, like I said, will take years, but the movement to get some kind of decision or some kind of movement on our request for precautionary measures, that's what we want to focus on now, and that's what we would like people's help with. Like I said, it's been about 6 months and we've had no movement on our request for precautionary measures, which is very unusual. And yes, the commission is busy, but still it is very, very unusual for it to take this long, to specifically because this is an emergency request for precautionary measures. And so we definitely believe that politics are at play here, and that we have a case where the commission, the Trump administration has cut funding to the OAS. They probably don't want to anger the Trump administration further for fear of further repercussions. So I think that they're trying to basically ignore this case. And so what can we do to make it so they can't ignore this case? Our next step right now as a legal team is we are going to send a follow-up letter and point out that in the 6 months since they have not moved on our request for precautionary measures, this all of the, or just highlighting some of the atrocities, including like from May until now, over 15,000 Palestinians have been killed. Over 15,000 Palestinians have been killed in that time that the commission has not moved on this. And pointing out that, the commission takes cases for violation of a single person's rights, right? A single person's life, every life. And every day that the commission is not moving, Israel is killing Palestinians, despite what they say about this, quote unquote, ceasefire being in place, where Palestinians are being killed every day. Since October 10th, when the ceasefire went into effect, you have over 240 Palestinians that have been killed, in addition to all the destruction, and Israel still not letting in enough aid. So we're going to make this point in the letter and put the commission kind of, and request that they acknowledge receipt and let us know what their next step is going to be. And at the same time, we are trying to reach out to the journalists in some of these Latin American countries that the commissioners are from, to see if they will, if we can get them to do a story on this case and the fact that the commission hasn't moved on it. So in a sense, to put pressure. The states themselves, I think that was the question. The commissioners are supposed to be independent of their countries. They're not appointed by their countries. They're supposed to be politically independent. And so it's not about the states, the OAS states supporting this, but it is about the commission feeling the pressure from their own human rights and legal community, and from the populations that they represent. So we kind of have an advocacy strategy that's based around that. And Maria, do you want to add to that? I'm sure I left a lot out.
No, I think you summed it up perfectly. And I think that's where the people power that Tariq talked about really comes into play here, right? Like, as a legal team, we take care of that correspondence with the commission itself, and we sort of remind them of the law, but there's just so many other things that can be done in order for this to be a petition that matters, and not just within the United States. One of the chief complaints against the IACHR is that it sort of only goes after the Latin American countries and holds them accountable for gross violations of human rights. Here's an opportunity to sort of right that wrong and hold one of the most powerful power in the region accountable, right? And what sort of helps us is just how awful things have gotten since the time we filed, but also just how enmeshed and entrenched the US has become further in this genocide. And that's something that we've laid out in so many more pages than the initial petition. And I think even just locally, really drawing attention to the fact that such a petition has been taken up by a group of very brave complainants who've put their names, their stories as part of this public document is also important. I think the average person sort of has that frustration of, well, what can we do? here's one of the things that we can do, we are doing. So really just supporting Taxpayers Against Genocide and NLG in furthering this work and continuing the momentum, because this is really very much the long game. We're not going to get a neat and tidy resolution, and that's okay. That's okay. Things like this take time. Inevitably, the law is a very slow moving process, but to keep that momentum going for the sake of the people of Palestine, but also their families overseas who have had to watch their slaughter in real time. I think that that's very necessary, that we keep our eyes and our minds like alert to the fact that this petition is ongoing. It's a live controversy before the commission. One of the things I found interesting was I checked today to see what they had issued precautionary measures on recently. And as recently as October 27th, they were doing what Huwaida just talked about, taking up the cases of individual complainants who have been treated terribly. Don't get me wrong, I'm not minimizing anything here, but you have these individual complainants who've been tortured or disappeared, human rights defenders in various countries. I think this one was El Salvador that they acted on in issuing precautionary measures for just last week. And here we are with 68,000 dead, with how many additional killed since the date of our filing. It really is inexcusable, and it's a shame, and it sort of already is exposing that moral bankruptcy that Huwaida talked about in these institutions, for us to not even have heard back about whether where we are at that very first preliminary step of, will you accept and entertain this petition? Will you issue precautionary measures? Forget the merits phase, forget the other phases where, this thing is being adjudicated and looked at. Are we even crossing that initial threshold? Where you'll entertain our petition? So yeah, that's all I wanted to add to what Huwaida has summed up very nicely.
Thank you both.
I'll just add one thing real quick onto that, Leigha, about the political strategy. So for folks in the audience, within TAG, we work obviously closely with the legal team, and we have a group in TAG that's specifically doing outreach to progressive organizations, social movements in the Americas. And we also want to reach out for journalists like Huwaida was mentioning, to get, because we're really building that kind of cross-border movement to isolate the U.S. as the driving force of so many abuses, genocide in Palestine, as well as so many abuses throughout Latin America. So if there are folks in the audience that have connections that you think might be helpful, either to journalists or to organizations, you can email us TAG directly, and we'll follow that. I'm going to put this in the chat. I assume that it's Taxpayers Against Genocide at gmail.com. Does that appear for the audience? Okay.
Yes.
So just email us, and then we would love to connect and organize. And we're also growing our numbers. So like when we filed the amended complaint in October, we had 4,000 taxpayers, roughly speaking, that officially signed on to this complaint saying we endorse this. Their names don't appear on court record, their names aren't put out publicly, but we're continuing to grow that as we move towards the hopefully action on precautionary measures. We'd love to say we have 10,000, 20,000 people across the country that are demanding accountability of the U.S. government for genocide.
One thing I really want to call attention to that I think is really unique about TAG and that I've really enjoyed watching and been really heartened watching is that both the case that was filed in federal court in California and this complaint had a lot of active participation from regular people who are not lawyers. And I thought that was really unique because although TAG has been working very closely with the NLG and obviously very specifically with Huwaida and Maria and the two other attorneys who are on the complaint, so much legwork has been done by the people who make up TAG in these working groups. And it's been so incredible to see just normal people going and actively learning the law and trying to help to gather evidence, draft pieces of the complaint to help these attorneys quickly put this together in a succinct way, review the complaint before it was filed, and provide feedback. And so I think this is really important to that people power point, is that you actually do not have to be a lawyer to understand the law and understand these violations and take an active step in participating in bringing these actions. And TAG is just such an incredible example of grassroots and watching a group of people. I mean, Seth, I think you and I got connected almost like a year and a half ago now. And TAG, I've watched TAG just grow like wildfire between California, and now there is a New York chapter, and it's continuing to gain momentum. And it just shows like there's fertile ground for people to really dig in and find a place to fit. And I really want to encourage people to continue to do that and to reach out to TAG through Gmail. Also, you can reach out to the NLG if you'd like to get more connected. And, you know, perhaps to the participants on this list, we might, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, maybe we could put some action items together, ways that they can engage with the complaint, promote the complaint, who they can contact if people want to really do phone calls or emails or anything like that in support. I think could be really powerful to continue to engage the group that's already been engaged, but also kind of broaden that engagement as well. And I think we're living in a time where nihilism is very easy. And so I think the more opportunities that we can give people and steer people to really engage and dig in is helpful, and provides us with a lot of hope that we really need at the moment. So I don't think that we have any additional questions. So I am just going
There
to
was one
ask.
that,
Sure.
can I just briefly address? There was one that I
Sure.
answered actually in the Q&A, but I only answered it briefly. Someone was asking like, what about the Leahy law?
Right.
And, you know, so we definitely mentioned in our petition that the US is violating its own laws. But also I mentioned that there was a case brought against the US government by Democracy for the Arab World Now. And they are trying a different approach to hold the US accountable. And it is saying that they brought it under the Administrative Procedures Act, which hasn't widely been used in this context before. So it kind of takes it out of this political sphere and doesn't, even though I think I haven't looked at it, but I think the US government is arguing political question. A political question shouldn't apply here because what is being argued is that under the Administrative Procedures Act, it's kind of a jurisdictional statute that says that it basically the United States has, or the government has, statutory obligations that they are, and the way they're behaving is arbitrary and capricious, and needs to be reviewed by a judicial panel that will compel compliance. And so the complaint just says, this is the Leahy law, this is what's supposed to happen, and the State Department is not applying it. And so it should theoretically, the last I heard, someone involved in that case told me that it's been fully briefed. I think there's a hearing coming up possibly this month. I don't know the exact date on the government's obviously making a motion to dismiss, but hopeful maybe under this, again, Administrative Procedures Act, we can force the US government to comply, to apply its own statutory obligations. So I hope that sufficiently answered the question that was asked in the chat about the Leahy law.
Huwaida, I don't know if you know, and this might not be the forum for the question because Dawn is not on this panel, but I know one of the questions that I've sort of wondered is with the changeover of the administration and the fact that this case that Dawn filed was against the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken, what is the impact of that now that there's a new administration in office as the case is being adjudicated?
Usually no impact. I think the case caption just changes, but the case continues. It doesn't mean that the case is dismissed or thrown out.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, I think they probably had to update and show that the same policy is being followed, in that the State Department is not following its own obligations. But yeah, as Mari said, it's technically, I think it's against the US government right now, or the State Department is the case caption.
Yeah, I believe the case was filed against both the Biden administration, like the executive branch, but specifically the State Department. And I also think that Blinken was named directly in the complaint as well. And I can just expand maybe a little bit because I was involved in the very beginning of when this case was starting, which essentially what the case alleges is that, as Huwaida said, there's a specific procedure that the State Department has to follow when there are potential violations of the Leahy law. And what the State Department did is they carved out exceptions for Israel in order to not follow that specific procedure. And so this case alleges that that carve out was a violation of the statutory requirements, and that is the basis for the lawsuit. So to Huwaida's point, instead of some of these other lawsuits that have gone on the merits of the US is committing genocide, or the US, or that the Leahy law is in fact being violated, it's that the State Department is not following the statutory procedures that are required, and as such, their actions are, in legal speak, arbitrary and capricious. And so it sort of frames this case in a way that should avoid the legal or the political question doctrine, which has been the preclusion for enforcement of the law against the US government and their complicity in genocide in Palestine. So I think that it is definitely an interesting case, and it's good to know that the switchover of the administration won't have any specific ramifications on this case being able to move forward.
I see a few things in the Q&A that just came up. One is Honoree Stenberg mentioned a case
That's
citation.
that's the case number for the Dawn case that's been
Got it.
filed in
Okay,
federal
got
court.
it. And then Angela Marino says that the site for the UC peoplestribunal.org has excellent evidence files. They put, yeah, that's a very important resource, ucpeoplestribunal.org. And then a question from Ola. When you say the government, who is that? Department of Justice, or is it lawyers in the State Department?
So that's what we just discussed, and I think Marie is also typing an answer here.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify for her that it's not
Sure.
individual people who you take to court. It's the government itself, in that you're naming the State Department, the head of the State Department, the Department of Defense, the head of the Department of Defense, and then sort of the parties in the executive branch who you're naming, but not individuals.
So with that being all the questions, I don't know if anyone has some last comments that they'd like to make before we close this out.
I think they the only thing I'll say is I think the people power is really part of the strongest parts about this movement, hands down. And I think with the energy that we just experienced yesterday, with Zohran Mamdani winning his historic election in New York, it really goes to show that despite the billionaires spending millions of dollars, more money than they would have been taxed by Zohran Mamdani, to try and fight against this man, and yet they still lost, is a testament to the ability of the people to continue winning against these people who think that money and power control everything. In reality, it is humanity, and it is justice, and it is our ability to see each other as human beings that really controls what happens in this world. And so I think I would very much encourage anyone who hasn't heard of Taxpayers Against Genocide to do the research, to join, to figure out what you can do. Because this is only happening because we all decided that we're sick and tired of these systems that have been murdering us for decades. And so I really, really want to hone in on that, and just that's the one thing that I always end, I think, all my sessions on, is just realize that you have the power to make change. It doesn't have to change the entire world, just your own community. So that's it. That's all I want to say.
I think that's a really great
It is.
note to end on.
It is perfect. And I'll just add one more line. You know, I became a lawyer because I was an activist and wanted to see like what are the legal mechanisms to get justice. And you learn, especially in international law, that it's actually really frustrating. And international law has always been a tool of these imperialist, you know, colonial states. And and even domestically, really throughout history, the law hasn't always been great, right? Slavery was legal, Jim Crow was legal. It takes the people power, it takes the movements in the streets working hand in hand with the law in order to change systems. So we'll do what we can domestically, internationally to try to push the law, but without the people moving. And we've seen so much movement. It's incredible. More internationally, like the people's movements in the streets is actually, if I'm going to give just a brief example from like the flotilla stuff that we were involved in. I mean, you had Italy and Spain and Greece and Turkey actually feel the pressure in trying to assuage the outrage in the streets amongst their constituents. They sent naval vessels technically to, you know, protect their civilians or civilians on the flotilla. It wasn't enough. It was kind of show. And they ended up turning back instead of sailing with us all the way to Gaza. But that is because there's so much outrage and people movement. And in Italy, they shut the country down. And that is the power that we have. And it is making change. We just have to keep at it with every person deciding, you know, assessing for themselves where do they fit in, what they can do. And each one of us has the power to do something. And collectively, you know, we're unstoppable. So thanks to everyone who is
Yeah.
part of this, who showed up today.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Tariq, Huwaida, and Maria for joining us to talk about the complaint, and also Seth. I put the link to the Taxpayers Against Genocide website if anyone would like to look that up and get involved. You can find the National Lawyers Guild at nlg.org or nlginternational.org. And if you're an attorney, we would love for you to join us. We're doing a lot of important work. We need more lawyers on our side, so we would love to see you as a member. And with that, everyone have a lovely evening, and hopefully we see you all again soon.
Thanks again, Leah, for organizing this.
You.
Of course. See
Yeah.
everyone.
Bye.